Number 9, 1799. Colonel Street. Dear Sir, my Negro man Harry, who has run away, I have no doubt is in the neighborhood, and I know of no better plan to apprehend him than by giving out that you have purchased him of me. I have told the Negroes that you have bought him. If he will come into you on these terms, please to put him to your work until you hear further from me. But if any person will give you $350 for him, please to write me a line by the post what you have done with him. I am in haste, yours, B. Williams. Harry was one of the many enslaved workers who is here on the plantation retreat that belonged to Governor Williams and his wife Elizabeth. Governor Williams bought the property here in 1799, and in the 1800 census, he's listed as having 48 enslaved workers. Just 10 years later, in 1810, he was listed as having 103. So just in the course of 10 years, he was able to double the size of his enslaved population, which really shows just how well he was able to profit off of the labor that was happening here on his property. When Governor Williams first bought the property here, he was inexperienced in how to own a cotton plantation. The first year, 1801, that he had cotton planted, he had 42 acres of cotton, and that produced 3,200 pounds of cotton. After that, in 1802, he had 200 acres of cotton planted. So even just to go from 42 acres in 1801 to 200 in 1802 shows how much he was able to have the land worked here by his enslaved workers. 1803, Governor Williams increased the number of outbuildings he had on his property. He wrote in a letter that he had plans to add wings to either side of the main house. He also had plans for a granary, a smokehouse, a carriage house, a weaving house, 2 gardens, a cotton house, a horse flat, which we think might be a ferry based on how close we are to the deep river. He also had an overseer's cabin built, as well as, quote unquote, 2 more houses. All of the labor that would have been done here on the plantation would have been done by enslaved workers. All of these buildings would have been constructed by enslaved workers. Not only were enslaved workers making the actual buildings, they were doing the actual tasks that each building was assigned for. There would have been skilled weavers in the weaving house. Horsemen would have been the ones to handle the stables and the horses. We do know that Governor Williams was very passionate about horses and horse racing, and one of the enslaved workers here was named Essex, and he was the one whom Governor Williams trusted to actually handle his prized horses. So I talked about how the buildings were built using enslaved labor. This labor would have come from skilled craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, and we do know that there's actual evidence that there were enslaved carpenters and blacksmiths here. When Elizabeth Williams was dealing with her husband's estate, she specifically mentions having, we don't know what Harry, the enslaved worker Governor Williams talked about in his letter to Colonel Street that I read at the beginning of the video. We don't know what his job was. In 1795, even before Governor Williams had moved here to the Horseshoe property, he placed a runaway ad in a New Bern newspaper talking about an enslaved man named David who had run away. David was listed as being 35, mulatto, and skilled with carpentry. We don't know if either of them was successful in emancipating themselves and escaping a life of bondage. In Elizabeth Williams's 1817 will, she lays out the fate for what happens to her enslaved workers. Some of them go off to family and friends, but there are 4 people in particular who get separate stories. She winds up declaring that Simeon, an enslaved man, will be able to choose his new master in Fayetteville. Says that Essex, Governor Williams's horse trainer, was to be emancipated, along with his wife Juno. Last couple enslaved workers to be mentioned as emancipated are Arnold and his unnamed wife. It's particularly interesting to look at Elizabeth Williams's will and to see which names have been passed down throughout the generations. In 1783, Governor Williams and Elizabeth wound up receiving about 40 enslaved workers as a gift from Governor Williams's uncle. Some of the names from the 1783 deed are on Elizabeth Williams's will, and at least one of those names is also on the will of her son, Benjamin William Williams. We're not entirely sure if the people whose names show up more than once on these 3 very different lists are the same people, but if they are, it was not uncommon for enslaved workers to pass amongst the same It was not uncommon for enslaved workers to pass along multiple generations of the same family of enslavers. But what happened to the enslaved workers after that? The honest answer is we don't know. We don't know how many of them were emancipated. We don't know how many of them ran away. We don't know how many wound up staying here on this plantation generations and generations and generations afterwards. We are currently in the process of trying to find some of the cemeteries for the enslaved workers. Williams was first buried. He was originally buried at a cemetery called the Dunn Family Cemetery, about a mile down the road that way, closer into Carthage. In 1970, he was moved here to the property along with his wife, his son, and his daughter-in-law. But the legend that goes back to at least 1913 says that when Governor Williams was buried at Dunn Family Cemetery, he was surrounded by the graves of his enslaved workers. We don't know if that's true, but if that is true, that does mean that the land he was originally buried in was used as a slave cemetery. There is evidence that somewhere on the land there is a cemetery called the Johnston Alston Williams Slave Cemetery. Johnston Alston Williams, all 3 different owners of the house here: Governor Johnston's relative, Philip Alston, and Governor Williams. So if they had a cemetery that was specifically set aside for their enslaved workers, the cemetery could hold the remains of enslaved workers dating all the way back to the time that Johnston owned the property. Since most enslaved workers were illiterate, their grave markers don't have names and dates written on them. Any existing markers are often field stones, and in just a few rare circumstances, there have been times when wooden boards that were used as markers are still around. These oblong depressions in the ground are often the most tangible evidence of unmarked graves. Over the past few months, we've been doing research to try to identify more of the enslaved workers who were here, and we've been able to discover some names. When looking at the land around us, and even the buildings that are here at House in the Horseshoe, it can be easy to forget that there were people who built these buildings, people who worked inside them with specific tasks, people who had dreams, thoughts, feelings, and names that have been lost to history. Today and every day, we think about these people and we say their names aloud to remember them and to honor them.